The ancient stones of St. Catherine's Convent seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. That was the first thing I noticed when Emma and I moved in 3 weeks ago. How our footsteps disappeared into the worn limestone floors. How our voices felt muffled against the vaulted ceilings. The renovation had transformed the main building into a spacious home while preserving the austere architecture, but the small chapel annex remained largely untouched, its wooden pews and ornate altar gathering dust in the dim light that filtered through stained glass windows. Neither of us was religious, but the property's isolation and historical character had charmed us immediately. The realtor mentioned nothing unusual in her eager sales pitch, just that the last tenants had left unexpectedly. I should have asked why. The first incident occurred on our 5th night. I was alone, unpacking books in the study, while Emma visited her sister in the city. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows through the arched windows. A sound like distant humming drifted through the hallway, a low, melodic murmur that seemed to emanate from the direction of the chapel. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I set down the book I'd been holding. The singing, if that's what it was, had a rhythmic quality, rising and falling with the cadence of prayer. I followed the sound through the main hall and toward the door that connected our living space to the chapel annex. The heavy oak door to the sacristy stood before me, its iron handle cold beneath my fingers. The singing grew louder, more distinct, multiple voices chanting in Latin, the words indecipherable but the devotional tone unmistakable. My heart thrummed against my ribs as I pushed the door open. Silence, complete and immediate. The sacristy lay empty, dust motes suspended in the last rays of sunlight that penetrated the small window. Yet the air felt thick, charged with an unseen presence. My eyes scanned the small room with its bare walls and empty cabinets. Nothing but the sensation of being observed, of being assessed, pressed against me from all sides. My mouth went dry as I backed away, pulling the door shut with trembling hands. I told Emma nothing when she returned. What was there to say? That I'd hallucinated a ghostly choir, that an empty room had filled me with inexplicable dread. But 3 days later, as we sat reading in the living room at dusk, her head snapped up at the same distant melody. Her face drained of color as she asked if I heard it too. I nodded, my pulse quickening as we moved together toward the chapel door. Again, our investigation revealed nothing but silence and empty space, yet Emma sensed it too. The weight of unseen eyes, the suffocating feeling of being judged. She suggested logical explanations, acoustics from a nearby church, recordings played by local teenagers as a prank. I agreed too readily, desperate to believe anything but the truth that was slowly crystallizing in my mind. Something resided in our home that didn't belong to our world. Over the following weeks, the occurrences intensified. The chanting became clearer, sometimes accompanied by the scent of ancient incense that clung to our clothes long after we'd fled the sacristy. We began documenting the events, noting that they always happened at sunset, always lasted exactly 7 minutes, and always ceased the moment we entered the sacred space. Emma researched the convent's history, discovering that the Order of St. Catherine had been known for their strict observance of Vespers, evening prayers conducted in the sacristy before a relic of their patron saint. My sleep deteriorated as the incidents escalated. I would jolt awake at 3:33 each morning, my body drenched in cold sweat, convinced that someone stood at the foot of our bed. The outline of a tall, gaunt figure in religious habit would hover just beyond focus. dissolving when I reached for the lamp. Emma began sleeping in the guest room, claiming my nightmares disturbed her rest, but the hollow look in her eyes told me she was experiencing her own visitations. As October darkened toward November, I noticed small objects rearranged throughout the house. My watch placed on the altar, Emma's rosary, a childhood keepsake she never used, wound around doorknobs. When confronted, each of us denied moving these items. The rational part of my brain grasped for explanations. Sleepwalking, forgetfulness, stress-induced memory lapses. But the cold knot of fear in my stomach knew better. Yesterday marked a turning point. While Emma was grocery shopping, I forced myself to enter the sacristy alone as the chanting began. Rather than opening the door and breaking the spell, I pressed my ear against the ancient wood, listening to the otherworldly chorus. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst from my chest as I recognized a pattern in the Latin phrases. They were calling a name, my name. With hands shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip, I slowly turned the iron handle. This time, I didn't push the door wide, but opened it just a crack, enough to peer inside without announcing my presence. The singing didn't stop. What I witnessed through that narrow opening has branded itself into my consciousness. The sacristy wasn't empty. A semicircle of figures in medieval habits stood before the relic cabinet, their faces obscured by shadows too deep to be natural. At their center stood a taller figure, its back to me, holding aloft what appeared to be ancient church records. Though I couldn't see what was written there, I knew instinctively it contained our names. I must have made some sound, a gasp, a whimper, because as one, the figures turned. I caught just a glimpse of their faces, or rather, the absence where faces should have been, before I slammed the door and ran. Emma returned to find me packing our essentials when I tried explaining what I'd seen. My voice caught in my throat, the words refusing to materialize. Instead, I showed her the bruises that had appeared on my wrists. Perfect bands of finger marks, as though I'd been grabbed by hands too cold to belong to the living. We're leaving tomorrow. The property manager was strangely unsurprised by our decision to break the lease, asking only one question. Had we removed anything from the sacristy? The question chilled me, because I suddenly remembered the small leather-bound book I'd absent-mindedly picked up during our first inspection and forgotten in my jacket pocket, a record of names dating back centuries. Tonight, as I write this, the chanting has begun again, earlier than usual. But it's different now, urgent, angry. The doors throughout the house have begun to shut and open on their own. Emma is asleep, sedated by the anxiety medication she took an hour ago. I won't wake her. Instead, I'll return the book to the sacristy and hope it appeases whatever presence has claimed us as its next entry. The alternative, discovering what happens when their prayers reach their conclusion, is something I cannot bear to contemplate. I only pray we haven't already been inscribed too deeply into the convent's eternal ledger to escape its judgment. The mountains have a way of watching you. I didn't believe it until I saw those words etched in the condensation, letters perfectly formed, as if drawn by a finger that wasn't there. The silence that followed was deeper than any I had experienced before, a vacuum that seemed to pull at something inside me, something I didn't know could be taken. The cabin had seemed perfect when we booked it. 4 days of seclusion in Serra do Espírito, miles from the nearest town, nothing but wilderness and the promise of peace. Mark had inherited some money and insisted on treating us all, himself, me, Alicia, and Trent to what he called a recovery weekend after the stress of the past year. None of us had any idea what waited in those mountains. We arrived Thursday afternoon. The cabin exceeded expectations. Rustic wooden exterior with modern amenities inside, panoramic windows overlooking dense forest, and a stone fireplace that became our nightly gathering spot. The property manager had left the key under a ceramic frog by the door, just as promised. No personal greeting, no neighbors, no interruptions, perfect isolation. The first day passed uneventfully. We hiked, drank, reminisced about college. Trent mentioned hearing something about local legends, but we were too busy enjoying ourselves to care. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day brought fog, thick, impenetrable fog that clung to the trees and reduced visibility to mere feet beyond the cabin windows. We stayed inside, playing cards and drinking more than we should have. Around sunset, Alicia mentioned seeing someone standing at the edge of the forest. We all looked, but there was nothing there, just fog. I dismissed it as her imagination, heightened by the third glass of wine and the ghost stories Trent had started telling. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching, faint, rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. My pulse quickened as I lay rigid in bed, straining to hear over the hammering of my heart. The scratching continued for exactly 17 seconds. I counted before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I told myself it was tree branches in the wind, despite the complete stillness of the air. The morning of the third day, I was the first one up. The fog remained, turning the world outside into a gray nothing. I walked to the kitchen to make coffee, passing by the large living room windows. That's when I saw it, written in the condensation on the inside of the glass. They come at night. My skin erupted in goosebumps, mouth going desert dry. The letters were perfectly formed, the condensation around them undisturbed. I frantically wiped the message away before the others could see it, convinced one of them was playing a prank. I questioned everyone at breakfast, watching their faces for signs of deceit. Their confusion seemed genuine. Trent suggested it might have been me, sleepwalking. I almost believed him. Later that morning, we decided to drive into town for supplies, despite the fog. When we reached our SUV parked in the gravel driveway, we found more messages, etched into the dew covering every window. Don't go. Look behind. They're watching. Stay inside. My stomach twisted into knots. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the air. Alicia suggested we leave immediately. Trent, trying to maintain his composure, mentioned that he'd read online about similar incidents in the area. Tourists finding mysterious messages, feeling watched. According to him, it was just local teenagers playing pranks on visitors. His dismissal might have been convincing if his voice hadn't quavered, if his hands hadn't trembled as he wiped away the warnings. We didn't go to town. We didn't leave the cabin again that day. The fog grew thicker, seeming to press against the windows like something alive. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, watching from just beyond the veil of white. That night, no one slept well. We agreed to cut our trip short and leave first thing in the morning. At 3:17 a.m., I woke to that scratching sound again. This time, it came from every window simultaneously. My heart raced so fast, I thought it might explode. My limbs felt leaden, paralyzed by fear. The scratching continued for exactly 1 minute before stopping. In the silence that followed, I heard something moving on the roof. Not footsteps exactly, but a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the wooden shingles. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When it did, The fog remained, thicker than ever. We packed hastily, speaking little. No one wanted to acknowledge the fear that had us all firmly in its grip. We practically ran to the car, throwing our bags in the trunk. That's when I noticed them. Handprints in the condensation on the inside of the car windows. Adult-sized handprints pressed flat against the glass, as if someone or something had been inside, looking out. The doors were still locked. The alarm hadn't been triggered. As we drove away, tires spitting gravel, I glanced at the rearview mirror. Through the fog, I could just make out figures standing in front of the cabin. 4 figures, arranged in a perfect line, watching our departure. 4 figures that looked exactly like us. We never spoke about what happened that weekend. We never returned to Serra do Espírito. But sometimes, on cold mornings when my bathroom mirror fogs up, I find messages waiting for me. And I know, with bone-deep certainty, that whatever was watching us in those mountains followed me home. It's watching me now. In the heart of the old commercial district, where shadows cling to brick facades like desperate memories, stands Whitmore's boutique. The display window, untouched for decades, emanates a peculiar stillness that seems to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Behind that antique glass, a solitary mannequin in a flowing white dress stands frozen in an elegant pose, her blank face eternally patient, her porcelain fingers delicately splayed. The locals call her the bride. I call her something else entirely. When Sarah took over the lease 3 months ago, I was thrilled. Her designs deserved more than our cramped apartment workroom. The rent was suspiciously affordable for such a prime location, but the realtor assured us the previous tenants had simply retired. What he failed to mention was their peculiar stipulation. The front display must remain untouched. Sarah laughed it off as superstition. I didn't find it so amusing. From the beginning, something about that mannequin felt wrong. Its proportions were slightly off, limbs too long, waist too narrow, neck elongated beyond human possibility. During daylight hours, with customers browsing and Sarah bustling about, I could almost ignore it. Almost. I volunteered to help with inventory and bookkeeping 2 nights a week. Sarah needed the assistance, and I needed to understand what was happening in that shop after dark. The first few evenings passed uneventfully, just the occasional settling of the old building and distant street noise. Then came the night I dropped my pen. Bending to retrieve it, a movement reflected in the computer screen caught my attention. I froze, breath trapped in my lungs. The mannequin's head had shifted, incrementally, but unmistakably, angling precisely toward my hunched form. My pulse hammered against my temples as I slowly straightened, keeping my eyes fixed on the reflection. The figure remained motionless, but its blank gaze now aligned perfectly with mine. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks. That explanation grew increasingly hollow with each passing night. The first subtle movements evolved into more brazen displays. I'd turn away to file paperwork, and when I looked back, her posture had changed. A hand slightly raised, fingers more tensely curled, shoulders rotated minutely in my direction. Never while I was watching. Always during those split seconds when my attention wavered. My throat perpetually constricted when alone in the shop. My shirt collar damp with cold sweat. Sarah noticed my deteriorating condition, but attributed it to overwork. How could I explain that her prized retail space was slowly unraveling my sanity? When I suggested updating the window display, Sarah reluctantly agreed despite the lease stipulation. I volunteered immediately, desperate to remove the mannequin. The next morning I arrived early, tools in hand, determination overriding my terror. The display window had a separate entrance, a narrow door with an antique brass lock. The key turned smoothly, but the mechanism refused to release. I applied more pressure until sweat beaded on my forehead, but the lock remained immovable. Looking up in frustration, I found myself staring directly into the mannequin's face. For the briefest moment, I could have sworn her lips curled into the slightest smile. I stumbled backward, the key snapping off in the lock. My heart pounded so violently, I could see my shirt jumping with each beat. Sarah was upset about the broken lock, but called a locksmith. When he arrived, he examined the mechanism for nearly an hour before declaring it perfectly functional. The door swung open effortlessly under his touch. Inside the display, the mannequin stood exactly as always, betraying nothing of what I'd witnessed. The locksmith departed, leaving behind veiled suspicions about my competence. Sarah's concerned glances carried similar doubts. That night, I insisted on staying late alone, determined to confront whatever haunted the display. As the hours crept past midnight, the air grew increasingly thick, as if the oxygen were being gradually replaced with something heavier, something ancient. The temperature dropped until my breath formed visible clouds. The overhead lights flickered rhythmically, like slow, deliberate pulses. I approached the window display, pressing my palm against the cold glass, separating the shop floor from the mannequin's domain. Under the sickly glow of the emergency lights, her white dress seemed to absorb and reflect the illumination simultaneously, creating an aura of ghostly luminescence. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The lights cut out completely, plunging the shop into absolute darkness. My muscles seized, paralyzed by primal terror. In that perfect blackness I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of fabric shifting against fabric. Then, impossibly, the whisper of bare feet on old hardwood, advancing with deliberate patience. I fumbled blindly for my phone, fingers trembling so violently, I dropped it twice before activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the display window. Empty. The mannequin was gone. Something cold brushed against the back of my neck, the sensation of porcelain fingers, or perhaps the delicate hem of a white dress. The lights returned as suddenly as they'd failed, flooding the shop with harsh fluorescence. The mannequin stood in her usual position, completely undisturbed. But as I approached on wobbling legs, I noticed something that stopped my heart. A single strand of my own hair, caught between her rigid fingers. Sarah arrived the next morning to find me sitting outside the locked shop, hollow-eyed and trembling. I told her everything. She listened patiently, her expression growing increasingly concerned. When I finished, she gently suggested I take time off. Stress, lack of sleep, an overly active imagination. How could I blame her? I never returned to the shop, though Sarah continues her work there. Sometimes she mentions small oddities, misplaced items, unusual cold spots, the faint scent of antique perfume that seems to follow her. She dismisses these with nervous laughter. She doesn't yet understand what I now know with bone-deep certainty. The mannequin doesn't want to leave, and she doesn't like being watched in return.